This is the first of the three, Theo and I agreed to calling these three Producing Music, and I called this first one Early Career and Finding a Voice, because I don't know many composers who really found their way or their ways, looking at two master students in the room at that point. You know, we feel the pressure as a student, particularly as an advanced student, to really know what we're doing. But Lord knows that in life experience, you get the opportunity to refocus, adjust, jump ship, try other stuff out. And you're going to find out that in the concerts there are actually three very clear paths that are being pursued. And I decided to put the three paths on both concerts to show that you can take your theme and vary it a lot, or at least I hope so. So here we go. This is an overview of this first one. We all know that in contemporary music a lot of works can be too long, but you can't tell unless one of the scores is visible in this direction how close to the end of the piece you're getting. But if you memorize this, you'll know how far I am in this, and then you'll know whether we're nearly there or not. So I'll be talking about my studies and the crazy thought processes and reactions I dealt with at the time. A subject that was going to be blatantly obvious for me as a 17, 18-year-old that I haven't been able to fully reconcile yet, about marginalization in new music. Two interesting things that really influenced how things developed in my career, not solely working within music, but working with other art forms. Many of you are doing combined art in your work. I'll look Meryl because she's doing audiovisual pieces a lot, and why not? And also the subject of music of global cultures. I'll let the cat out of the bag immediately as far as that's concerned. I almost decided to do a PhD in ethnomusicology, and during the study of that PhD, I found too many conflicts between the musicologists and the kind of anthropologists within the field at the time, and I felt I don't want to fight their battles. I want to love this music. I want to respect this music and appreciate it and know more about it. So that stuck with me, but I didn't become an ethnomusicologist as such. So I talk about sampling, as that's going to be a very important through line in these talks and on the concerts. And it wouldn't be right to just talk and not give you an idea of some work, so that's probably going to take about half the time, some compositions and stories about them. But the marginalization will be the bridge between this talk and all that follows. So that's your overview of this 50-minute session. I was, as I told a couple of you just now, born in the US, and because I have family in the US, I never got rid of that passport, although in recent years, increasingly, I'm seriously considering doing so. It's the only country in the world that I'm aware of that you have to pay a fortune to get rid of the passport, if you didn't know. And it's a long negotiation with your embassy. But I am a Dutch citizen, and that was the second of three countries in which I've resided for long periods. The third being Great Britain, as you know, because I work at De Montfort in Leicester in the UK, which is a partner with the South African College of Music, UCT, which I'm very, very proud of, very happy about. So I studied undergraduate and most of the postgraduate at Columbia University in New York, and there are people in the room representing UCT and Pretoria, which means you're the Oxbridge or Ivy League of South Africa, and I too, for better or worse, spent a lot of years in a prestigious university. I have to say that the quality of education there was absolutely outstanding in general. There were a couple of tutors that I thought, can't you communicate? Why am I not getting what you're trying to get me to learn? Inevitable, but absolutely fantastic. However, the music department of that time, 1970s, some of you weren't even in the fantasies of your parents at that time, so it's a long time ago. The majority, I think all but one of the composers, was creating second/third generation atonal, if not serial music. That in itself is not a problem, but the fact that they expected their students to do so as well, that was potentially a cause for concern. You will also know, because you are all so involved and knowledgeable about the contemporary arts, that the 1970s was one hell of a time to be in New York. I do not hesitate to suggest, not necessarily from pride, but just from the experience, that it was the cultural capital of the entire globe. Everyone passed through New York. Everything was there for a student to see and experience, and the ability to actually meet and greet and converse with artists in music and beyond was amazing, particularly downtown. Columbia University's 116th Street, that's a big number, so uptown seems kind of relevant. And the downtown scene took place in the very, very low streets, but actually mainly below them in Greenwich Village and what was to become Soho. And I really, in my free time, spent as much time downtown as uptown, because the art that was going down there was wild and woolly, taking me places I didn't know existed, and they created a dire contrast from the classroom in New York. So as I've said to some already, but I'm happy to repeat on this occasion, I had the pleasure, within inverted commas, of a second adolescence as a music student. We've all treated our parents badly at some point in our lives, and we all live to regret the bad treatment of our parents. But I do not regret the bad treatment of my composition teachers, because they were forcing me down a path where I did not think I wanted to spend my life. One quick anecdote, because I don't want to tell too many stories to get in the way with what I really want to present. As a master's student, I was studying with Charles Wuorinen. I don't know if you've all heard of him, but he did win a Pulitzer for his only electronic piece that I remember getting played in a concert, and it took 2 minutes that he finally discovered it was being played at the wrong speed. So, you know, if contemporary composers don't know what their pieces are supposed to sound like, that's very telling, I would suggest. Another thing that I discovered during that time, mainly uptown, but not solely, but downtown, it could occur depending on the venue and the kind of continuity of attendance of events, was that the public then, as it is today, was not large. At Columbia University, the quality of concerts was very high, because you had the Manhattan School of Music 2 blocks away and Juilliard 5 stops on the Underground. But you had somewhere between 20 and at most 40 people sitting in a very big theater. And the joke that I tend to repeat too often is that they were all colleagues, except one begrudging friend or partner who sat there wondering, will this near-death experience end soon? Which raised all sorts of questions, which you're all aware of. But I got that when I was young, and that really was rather derailing. So let's move on. It therefore occurred to me, without thinking as I do now. I now live in the country that's probably best known for Margaret Thatcher, which is a hell of a thing to be known for, that she would say, you know, on an economic model, the thought of all the time going into the creation of a work, to be followed by too little rehearsal, leading to a poor performance, where the première is also the dernière, is probably economically not the soundest way to go. And that made me, certainly as a later ethnomusicology student, think of music as a cultural phenomenon, as why has this happened, and what can be done about it. I must remind you that this was the 70s, the years in which people like Philip Glass, Steve Reich and Terry Riley were gaining fame rather quickly. What I found particularly interesting was how they gained fame by the dancers, the theater people, the video art people. Now, whatever you think of the music they make, and I actually think quite highly of a lot of what they've done, it is music on which you can tread. It gave those other artists the opportunity to say, I really love the contemporary arts, I'm really into minimal music. Which said, Cage, you're our guru because you've opened our minds, but I don't know anything that you've ever composed. Those guys uptown will be in a morgue of atonality. I don't even need to hear it. No curiosity to find out about it, but this is fine. And why was it? Because there were links to music that people had already heard, and it's relatively easy listening. The early pieces of Philip Glass, perhaps accepted with the parallel fifths that were a bit of a journey of, I got it now, when does it end? So this idea of marginalization of music, or alternatively, how accessible is this music? How can some or all of this music become accessible? That was to become the most important subject of my work, both as musician and as scholar, and as teacher, and as somebody in the community. All of them, all of them. So you will not be surprised when I say I will be coming back to this subject now and then. So as I mentioned, there were two independent major discoveries, working with other art forms, which started, lucky for me, quite early, in that I don't remember how the initial contact was made. I think it was a mutual friend, that one of the key dancers from Merce Cunningham, who, as most of you, if not all of you know, worked closely with and was partner of John Cage for decades, and was, I believe, the most important choreographer of his time. Well, one of his top dancers was equally a choreographer, and he asked me to work with him in a performance in St. John the Divine Cathedral, which is across the street from the Columbia campus, but is the biggest cathedral in the Northern Hemisphere. And for a music for 30 people is kind of a big venue. But for dance it was great. And for electroacoustic sound projection it was fine because you had guaranteed 2-hour reverb time. Of course, this guy had bought into Cunningham's don't rehearse with the music, let it happen in real time and see what comes out. That was a journey that was a bit radical for me at the time. Found it interesting and decided I'm not going to do that again. But what an opportunity, and by the way, a hell of a lot of people showed up, which I hadn't seen yet from my own music. As you will discover, this led to many collaborations over the years, some very, very precious to me, and a lot of my work still involves other art forms, which I'm very pleased to say. The music of other cultures I put in here at this early point in these talks. Well, I think it's really influenced by Theo Herp's decision to name the institute, which he hopes will be formalized in the not too distant future. That is to be called the Dizu Placi's Institute of African Music and Technology. And the inclusion of the word African differentiates this from any such institute on the planet. I know the Mexican National Center for Music and Sonic Arts, but that doesn't mean it's Mexican music and sonic arts. But putting the African in that strategic place offers the question of awareness about our own cultures and to what extent we deal with them in our art. So I'm underlining that for that reason, but also due to the fact that in the concerts, one of the three strands is that one. The work with Dizu was that in the extreme, and the most gratifying experience I can describe. Now, let me look at the time. Yeah, this is perfectly fine. So from very early career, I, like all of my fellow, that's gendered words, so all the students of my same year or a year above or below were trying to find a voice. And there was Charles Wernin, I didn't finish that story, but I will now, asking me to find my voice to compose the way he did. So I was a master's student, and what I haven't told you was to please my parents, I did a Bachelor of Science in Applied Maths and just took a whole music major as I could, which was quite a challenge because I did a 4-year course in 3, so getting all that to take place with the high cost of a private US university was interesting. So as a first-year master's student, Wernin asked me to make a chamber piece based on some kind of atonal process. And we would sit in a group of 5 master's students, or 6, and we would talk every week about the progress of our pieces, mainly about the techniques of how the pieces were being composed. Now, I was pretty good at computer programming, I can tell you, having done that BSc. So I wrote a little program. It took me the better part of 15 minutes to write a 12-tone piece. Yes, I composed the 12 tones. Okay, that was my input, and then the Fortran program took over, and it wrote about 11-minute piece for a very strange combination of instruments that should never happen, but that was also intentional, and it created the piece. And I came into his weekly session with about 16 to 20 measures of music every week, the whole piece having been composed in less than 2 seconds. At the end of which, he said that I was the most improved student in this master's group, and what was I doing next? And I said, 2 things. There are 5 sections of this piece, and sections 1, 3, and 5, all of the rhythms that are there are going to be erased because I want them to feel time. And the second thing is never to write anything like this again. But you should also know, here's the computer program, and that's how it was composed. And he kicked me out. So that was the apex of my adolescence. I just thought that's a story that's worth telling. I mean, you get more out of that story than anything else I could tell you about the piece. But what I did discover early on, not necessarily at Columbia, but shortly afterwards, was that I started recycling stuff. Whether it was a text that was to be then cut to bits like Berio did with words in his wondrous pieces from the 60s, or, as I'll exemplify in a few minutes, that I would take world music and I would transcribe it, and then I would maybe arrange it for what it wasn't intended for. And if it had a text, and I'll give you an example of that in a few minutes, I would translate it from its native language into English phonetically, coming up with the most surreal, nonsensical text you could imagine. And the idea didn't come from me, it came from a poet from the Columbia Music Department, so I felt I had legitimacy doing that. And throughout these talks, we'll be coming back to recycling and sampling, because really that's the thing I do the most. I mean, I usually say to students, my interest is to be experimental and innovative, but I say to you is I just enjoy sampling and see where the journey takes me. So there we go. But what was interesting in this early phase was I was doing all this recycling, and I would occasionally say about a single piece that I was recycling something, but I didn't realize that I was actually sampling, because you're not old enough to know. But when I was a student, you did 20,000, 30,000 samples per second. You halved the number, and that was the top frequency you could produce on a computer. There were no sampling artists, because we didn't use the word sample. You've read about Pierre Schaeffer. He never uses the word sample, because we didn't at the time. So this is a through line that we're going to pursue. So that's kind of the context of those early years. And I thought I'd play a few early works and discuss a few of them briefly. Just, you know, these guys that have treatment for male hair, and the before picture and the after picture, well, the rest of this talk is very much before. The first piece, which some of you heard in the sessions last week, and I apologize that you're going to hear a few clips that you heard already, because that was the batch that was right and ready in the classroom, so that I could grab them quickly, is from 1972, and I can't remember which side of my bachelor that was, because that's the year I got that bachelor's degree. I tend to think it was just after. So I felt I wanted to write a composer that sounded right to me, and I had just started my journey in what the US calls electronic music, and started my journey in computer music, which is a term I really don't use at all anymore, just to see what sound I felt I could make. Now I need to say very briefly that as a kid I did some composing. And one thing I found that I could do really well, which has become absolutely no use to me, what a shame, is I make fantastic melodies. So here's somebody known in the world of electroacoustic music who actually can write songs. So you heard it from me first, but forget about it, because we're probably not going to come back to that at any point. So therefore, in '72, I also did my first, my sort of opus 1 electroacoustic music. So we're talking a half a century of this stuff. So this piece I wrote, 5 introspections for solo flute. There are 5 very short pieces, of which this is the first introspection. And I'm going to play it and then say something briefly about it. Isan, I assume, sounds on? Thank you. Here we go. A talented young chappie, making music that was probably 40 years after its time, very inspired at the time, and still now by Bela Bartok, Bartok Bela if you do it right. I wasn't adding anything, but I didn't have the knowledge, ability, or any idea how to go about adding anything, and I just wanted that melody maker part of me exploring an instrument that I couldn't play, and they're pretty little ditties that have something that touches the mind because it's mildly dissonant and you don't know what's coming next, but hopefully also touches the heart. And that axis, which I mentioned early in this first of 6 talks, that axis to the heart was the antithesis of composition training. It was all in the head. And interestingly, as you all know, the history of electroacoustic music, the cohabitation of IRCAM and GRM in Paris was absolutely, the heads go to the Pompidou Center and the hearts go to Radio France. And never the twain did meet. Still to this day there are still tensions, although they're friendly with each other. A couple of years later, when I left Columbia, because I'd been invited by one of the superstars that I had the joy of meeting as a student, who at one point had a girlfriend who lived 2 blocks from Columbia University. Morton Feldman called me up and said, I want to talk to you about something. I got the feeling you're not enjoying this ethnomusicology stuff a lot. And in the meeting where all of the people who in the following year would be taking their doctoral exams in ethnomusicology, I told the German professor I had, I'm sorry, I can't come. I have an urgent meeting I have to come to, and I cross the street to the Chocolate of Nuts coffee shop, where Morton and I had, you got refills in those days for nothing. He said, look, I'm working in Buffalo, New York. It's a cold place, far away. It's twice the distance from here to Pretoria, more or less. No, half the distance from here to Pretoria, more or less, within the state of New York, and has the coldest winter in the US, I believe. And it was horrible. I'm going to get you a scholarship, and you and I can work together a bit, but it's Lejaran Hiller, so the person who started computer music. You're going to be his assistant. You won't have to do any teaching, but if there's stuff in his research where he wants a little bit of help, you can go there and you can compose anything you like, and we're going to get you through this PhD, 1 year studying, and then write it up. And that's exactly what happened. I froze in a very open artistic environment with a fantastic world-class art gallery. And therefore the concert season was almost as exciting as going downtown, but within this tiny city, meeting people all the time, because if you were there were so few people. I guess you'd get that at your universities. There are so few people that you have that chance to meet and really get to know them. The other thing about Buffalo, very briefly, because it's historically very interesting, was that Lucas Foss, who worked both at the university and with the Buffalo Symphony Orchestra, instituted a creative associate program which at its peak involved 10 musicians a year. When I was there, I was down to 3 or 4 top-notch performers in residence at the university, and the composers could work with them. That was beyond words. But even better was June in Buffalo, which continues to this day. At that time, 3 weeks, and I did the before I started and after I ended. Before I started, Morton Feldman was there, Cage was there for a week, Ro Brown was there for a week, Christian Wolff was there for a week. The New York Action School in 3 weeks. Unforgettable. Unforgettable. The end was Xenakis, Reich, and George Crumb. You couldn't have had a more eclectic mix. And I was responsible for Xenakis because I knew him already. And I drove him around Buffalo. He says, "Oh, mon frère, my brother, this city looks just like Moscow." These are all these little moments and bits and pieces that you never forget. You absolutely never forget. Anyway, the first piece I made at Buffalo was a piece called O Faccia d'una Luna, The Face of the Moon, which was a madrigal that I sung in secondary school. And all the kids tried to mispronounce faccia as faccia, which sounded like something else. So that's why I got that title. And I'm not going to talk about all the parts, but just giving an indication of recycling stuff. The first movement was less than a minute, which had people vocalizing and singing a text by Marcel Duchamp, which starts, "Imagine a society in which you have to pay for the air you breathe." I love it. I just love it. The second movement, if I remember the chronology right, was a Bulgarian tune, always sung by women, that I called it Hommage à Doppler, because I had this thing sung and then there was a semitone switch and it went on, so there was a Doppler moment in the middle of it, so that I could get enough verses in, as in the Bulgarian text, of which I spoke no word, and I transcribed it into English. And if anybody wants to have some fun, I'm going to put the score online soon, and its text is just out of sight. Complete nonsense. There was a Feldman movement, which was slow and quiet, because that's how he defines his music. And East does not meet West, that's the whole piece actually, which To Holland, each does not meet West. Well, To Holland was important because I was about to leave the States permanently and move there. But it was a transcription of Balinese Anklung. That's these bamboo things, that's water shakers that you play like that. You know, good. And that was sung. But the thing about Anklung is it's never quite the same pitch, so it's always drifting within a quarter tone. And transcribing that and getting people to do it, wild. And there's always these small rhythmical variations, like you have in a good African drumming thing, that you really feel. So I just transcribed it and put my name on it. So Kevin Bolans, you were not first. I did it before you did. I appropriated it because I didn't know that. Oops. I'll go away. Wolken, Wind, Schermen for oboe, flute, and multiple recordings. The Afrikaners here probably get all three. The schermen, screens. The Wolken is clouds. Schilderij, painting. This is a text and graphic score in which the originally oboist and later flutists were allowed to do it, and I've had 3 people go through this journey because it's a hell of a job. Thank you, John Cage. Just write a little bit and have the musicians do all the hard work, and you get credit for it. Okay. You were asked to create a time plan of a trip around the world during some points you would play music from these various cultures. The schermen, the screens, would be extended techniques for your instrument, which would mean multiphonics and the like. I guess the wind would take you from one place to another, and there were other aspects, all described in text. And each interpretation of this was entirely different for obvious reasons. Some of which were absolutely amazing, and one of which ended up on a CD, which was rather nice. I worked from the mid-70s, and you'll get an example of that a bit later in this talk. Second talk, I think. Michel Jaffrenou, who I met via early girlfriend in my life from France. Well, actually, she was French living in Germany, who introduced me to Michel. And when I met him, we clicked, even though I was a student and he was a young beret, cafe, chat, these stereotypical French artists that could be my dream. He said, I have a gallery exhibition, and our theme is ambiguity. So one piece I made for him was called Ambiguïté, which I had English, French, and Spanish dictionary definitions. I got cut to shreds and spread out through the space. And another piece was called Regiones Vocales, vocal regions, for 7 voices. And I'm sorry this faded so much. But each part had a different length. It was to be sung by 7 people in several rooms, and if they got near someone, they got louder. If they were on their own, they got quieter. And of course, the public's walking around, indeterminate length. And I've had the pleasure of putting this on in about 4 museums, so I have 6 rooms. Yeah, it's really interesting. Here's a clip from the Buffalo one. It was again a Cage-influenced sound space, and let it happen by themselves and find ways so that they can kind of interpret what they were doing. When it was done in the Gemeentemuseum in The Hague, the person from the Rotterdam newspaper used the phrase, making me wonder what he actually thought of it, tant de bruit pour une omelette. And so it was a French phrase in a Dutch newspaper, which is enough noise to make an omelette. So I'm not quite sure he was convinced by it, but there you go. To each his own. I didn't want to play it yet. Right. I'm only doing instrumental music because in the before picture there aren't that many electroacoustic pieces. And then there's a switch that's going to happen, as you can probably guess. I was asked by a terrific pianist who was in Buffalo to make a piece for him, and ironically, he was the one who was never going to play it, but I've had others do it who were absolutely terrific. And I thought, yeah, let's do an homage using this idea of sampling, but I didn't call it that at the time, of painters. Cedar Tavern is the tavern in New York City where the abstract expressionists used to hang out. So Jackson Pollock would be seen drinking there with Mark Rothko and people like that. And Cage and Feldman went there often as well. So I wish I had been around at the time, because that would have been the salon of salons for wild art, wouldn't it have been? And the piece has 3 movements. One where I was inspired by a very specific Jackson Pollock painting. Another one that was inspired by Mark Rothko painting. And I'm going to play short clips from them. And a third one where I had the piano prepared ever so quickly with some sticky tape, masking tape, and 2 or 3 screws in very specific notes. And that was, no, I'm blanking, Mark Toby. However, the content, the first one was just influenced by the spirit of Cage, I suppose, because it's hard to read, but, oh, maybe you can read because that's bigger. Each one of those has a color. So the top one's white. Each one has a color. And the Pollock painting was primarily white, so the white is to be played more than the other colors. The other ones are to be fed in. And of course, we all know that trained pianists are not necessarily improvisers. So 2 of the people that are playing it have written out what they do, because they just can't do it in real time. And this score actually went into a book about the relationships between music and art, a German musicologist, a brilliant book, and I was, wow, really honored at that time to be included in it. So here's a clip of Joe Kubera playing in the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, part of this first movement. Second one, that was the Mark Rothko inspired one, that was both an homage to Feldman, but somebody else whose music I adore, Eric Satie, which you're going to hear very quickly. I heard this for the first time since over 10 years recently, and I thought to myself, why did you stop doing this? I really love that. It just really goes right into it. Never mind. I'm going to go ever so slightly over time because I want to talk about don't do that. Okay. I want to talk about these two pieces because they're so different from everything I've been talking about, and it does round out this early phase, just leaking into the 1980s. One big phenomenon, I now moved to Amsterdam. One phenomenon of that period was the presence of pinball halls all over the place. So I decided that I was going to make a pinball piece, and just timestamp, because you are so knowledgeable, Tommy, the opera by The Who, existed already. They didn't take it from me, I took it from them. And Tommy was a pinball wizard, if that's not reflected, but there you go. So there was one near where I lived, which was pretty close to Central Station of Amsterdam, and I spoke to the director and I asked, can I go in early and make recordings of these before the hordes of people come in and start playing? Because the cacophony of all these pinball machines playing at full blast is, that's it's sight to hear. Oof. And he allowed me in for an hour, and I went to the Stang studio where they gave me wonderful ceramic contact microphones, and I played and played, and realized how bad I was at pinball machines, which is kind of too bad because the sequences were shorter than they could have been, but let's leave that for now. That's about the maladroit composer. The doors opened and they kind of trickled in, and this kid, who couldn't have been older than 13, starts playing. And there was the pinball wizard. And I am going to say something that's relevant to the piece. He was Turkish. So there's the pinball wizard, and I asked him, I'm going to pay you to play. Can I record you playing? And that's how I got the solo bits of this piece, despite that there were general noises. And then I just recorded the ambience and the piece. And I decided it was going to be like a bolero for pinball machines. So there's your musical idea. It started with a mechanical one, because as a child, I had one in my house. That was one of my biggest birthday presents of my youth, was a do-it-yourself pinball machine that had ding, 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 all acoustic, nothing plugged in. So at the beginning of this piece, you have an acoustic pinball machine that's been recorded. And it goes on through the whole piece. It builds up and builds up and builds up. I mean, I'd love to play it for you, but then we'd have no break. And at the end, this very loud situation goes, the only time I use an effect on the pinball machines. And that one that was there in the beginning is still there at the end. So the piece is called What's Left. That's what's left. But if you put in a question mark, what's left? And there were a lot of leftist governments, which for me was a good thing in the Netherlands because there was no poverty anywhere. The phenomenon of the pinball hall and the money going in, mainly by poor people, was a concern to me. So there's part 2 to the story. I'm sorry I'm extending it, but I think you're going to find it worth it when I get to the end. Is that a yes, Theo?
Absolutely.
Oh, thank you so much. Your generosity is very welcome. When I made this piece at the Institute of Musicology of the University of Amsterdam, real top university, what am I doing in these crazy other ones now? But okay. I had to do it after hours because our little studio was used quite a lot, and the only other person in the building was a cleaner. And it took quite a long time to get this set up. I had 3 Revoxes, or maybe 4. And so every once in a while I could see him standing outside the door, and we started chatting. His Dutch was fundamental, but we could communicate. And there was a horrible coffee machine in the building, so I would buy him a cup of coffee, and sometimes he'd buy me a cup of coffee. And after maybe a week and a half or 2 weeks of this, he comes in and he gathers his strength up and he says, "Sir, what are you doing?" And I said, "I'm making a piece." And then he decided I should probably be put in the nut asylum and continued cleaning the building. Then the big day came when I had to mix everything onto one stereo recording. I was soaking wet with sweat. Something goes wrong, gotta start again, because there ain't no digital around to do this. And I make the piece. And he comes in, cup in hand, and sits down, and the most incoherent, unexpected discussion, conversation of my life transpires. He says, "You are right." My reply, "Right about what?" "About what you were doing." "Oh, that's good." And then the biggest non sequitur of my life transpires. "Do you know my cousin?" Answer, "I don't think so." "Do you know what he does?" No. "He's a butcher in Hilversum." "That's good." "How's he doing?" Well, his business is going pretty well." "And what are his plans? What are his future plans?" "He wants to earn enough to go back to Eastern Turkey to build a hotel so he can support his whole family." "Yes, that's great. That's absolutely fantastic. That's what, you guys are treated so badly. Get the money, run, take it out, and do something good for yourselves." "But do you know how much money he has?" "Oh, I'm afraid I don't know that either." "Well, virtually none, because he's throwing it into these pinball machines and the fruit machines, and he has nothing in the bank. So please make a cassette for me so I can take it to all the Turkish centers in the Netherlands and play it to these people to warn them against getting absolutely stuck with them." So I had a dramaturgy of this piece. I did. It was pretty good. But on the Richter scale, it was there, and his was there. I don't care what happened with the piece after that. After he said that, it became so powerful that that's the living memory of that piece, regardless of any performance that took place after. So I hope you found that story worth sharing, because you never know what could happen with something you're doing, how you touch people, in what way you touch people. And in the next one, Marina was the first of what I had hoped would become a series of music in nature. Site-specific performance, pro scores, not terribly sophisticated parts for people to play. In other words, kids could play the parts in a music school, whatever. And this idea was to simulate the sounds of a boat harbor, because I just love boat harbors, hearing the ropes against the mast of sailing vessels and just the general sound of water and everything else at a boat harbor. It's beautiful. Like, why compose music when you've got that? So I had brass players doing the sounds of horns, spatially all over the place. I had a few bells that remind me of the buoys in the sea that mark where you can and cannot go, and so on. There's not that much more. And I got invited by the Paris Biennale, which was quite an honor, given my young age at the time, to do it on the Pont Neuf and both sides of the Seine. What a location to be offered. Like, hello, Christo had covered it up, so, well, that's okay, fine. Yeah. Sure. Line up all these kids, line up some péniches, you know, those flatboats that go down the Seine. Some of the brass were on them, so it was ephemeral what they played. There were a few on both sides of the river. And of course I had the biggest public of my life because the people walking by during that hour that stopped, it was astonishing. And Michel Jaffrenou, of whom I'll speak more in the next hour, made a video that was just so fantastic. It was like a water faucet with the semblance of a hose pipe going down, and at the bottom of the structure holding up the video monitor, there was a hose pipe that went into the Seine. So this another connection with water that had nothing to do with the piece, but it just raised the experience. I was there with the wife of Heiner Müller. If you don't know him, I'm going to come back to him, because I worked with him for a decade, and he's one of the biggest influences in my life, as I shall explain. And Ginka was Bulgarian, and her French was that big. But she got in conversation during that performance in Paris with a clochard, a poor guy, who basically was sleeping rough on the Ile de la Cité side under the Pont Neuf. Turns out this guy's an intellectual. And she recounted the following conversation. She says, this guy, I think, is better than John Cage. And she says, how so? Well, he thinks you can do anything anywhere, and he once gave a concert here too. And I just couldn't get it, even though I understand his thoughts. But this composer has studied the history of my house, and I'm grateful for that. The concept behind the piece was pretty wild, but I got lapped again. And the things that happen when you're innovative with sound, and you're innovative place, and you're innovative with thought, and you have your own dramaturgy, which is not the sole dramaturgy, because intention and reception do not have to be identical. These stories drive me more than my pieces, I'm afraid I have to admit. But that issue about small audiences stayed a permanent migraine in my head. And it remained during these years difficult to get gigs, even though the art scene in the Netherlands was particularly good and the distance to other countries was particularly small. And so this problem is going to inform part 2 of this talk, and also the scholarship talks, because it really helped establish what I would do and what I would write about. And with that in mind, thanks for listening.